Hi guys, so I'm here today to do a book haul, of which I'm sure you know the drill by now. So without further ado, let's jump into the books, shall we? So the first book I have to hand is a book I picked up myself in Persephone Books. So Persephone Books is a publisher who has a shop in London. They're an independent publisher that specifically publish out of print classics mainly by women, sort of trying to shine a light on overlooked female authors. And I was walking past the shop, as you do, popped in and was completely taken by the description of this book. It sounded absolutely wonderful, and it's Tory Heaven or Thunder on the Right by Margarita Lasky. Now her uncle Harold Lasky was quite a famous socialist, and this book is a bit of a dystopian type book from what I gather. It first came out in 1948 and imagines a Britain in which the Conservative government are in power and have introduced an extreme hierarchy to society in which people are classed by letters, and some people are better than other people. I say dystopian because the UK is currently under Conservative government, and although we haven't all been lettered, it's still a bit of a mess for lots of people, and the hierarchy definitely exists. So it will be really interesting to read this kind of speculative Britain that Lasky was writing about in the 1940s, and think about it in the context of the time she was writing it, just after World War II, as well as what has happened in Britain since she wrote this book. I'm really intrigued by this. I think it sounds wonderful, and if you're not familiar, Persephone's books are all these gorgeous plain grey covers which are just stunning and have different patterned end papers inside. However, this one also had this nice little wraparound detail, which I thought was quite nice. I also picked myself up the next book in Waterstones, and that is Ice by Anna Cavan. This is a Penguin Modern Classics edition, and I just think this is such a stunning book. I was instantly drawn to the cover, that's what made me pick it up, and then I read the back and thought it sounded really interesting. It's about a man who, in this icy cold landscape, is chasing the woman he loves, trying to catch up with her. However, this woman is running away from him and the danger he poses to her. So I think this sounds like a really interesting concept. It could deal with abusive relationships, domestic violence, unhealthy obsession. That's kind of what I'm guessing going into it, but I don't know much else than what the blurb described to me. But it is technically science fiction, so I don't know what the context for this icy cold climate is, but it does seem to be like massive climate change. And this book came out in 1967 originally, so I'm keen to read this. I was then sent the next 6 books by Canongate very kindly, and it is their new editions of the Canongate Myth series, or at least the 6 most popular books in that series. I've read quite a few from this series. It's a series I adore, although I haven't read all of the ones they've sent me, so I think that I'm going to really enjoy getting to experience some of these. But they all have like gorgeous matching covers. If you can see, I'll show you them all here. Firstly, we have The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ by Philip Pullman. This one is obviously based on stories from the Bible, and it imagines a scenario in which Christ and Jesus were different people and they were twin brothers, I believe. So I think that will be really interesting to read. I like Philip Pullman, so I'm glad to have a copy of this one because this isn't one of the ones I've read. I then have The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which I'm sure you've heard me talk about at some point in the past. This is one of my all-time favourite books. I adore this story. It is a retelling of the Odyssey, which is an ancient Greek epic poem from the perspective of Odysseus' wife Penelope, who is at home in their kingdom whilst he is off fighting the Trojan War. And yeah, I love this book. I also have Lion's Honey by David Grossman, which I haven't read yet, but this is based on the myth of Samson. Ali Smith's Girl Meets Boy, which I have read. This one is based on the myth of Iphis, which is in Ovid's Metamorphosis, and it's set in contemporary Scotland and kind of plays with gender and sexuality and is really wonderful. We then have A Short History of Myth by Karen Armstrong. So this one's actually a non-fiction book. It's the first in the series, and it kind of sets the series up by looking at the history of mythology. And lastly, another one of my favourites, which is Wait by Jeanette Winterson, which is a retelling of the Greek myth of Atlas, and again, truly stunning. So I'm really grateful to have these gorgeous new editions of those books. I was also sent another lovely little set of books, this time from Princeton Press. These are all non-fiction books in a series on how to do things on the basis of ancient advice. So we've got How to Be a Friend, an ancient guide to true friendship. How to Win an Election, an Ancient Guide for Modern Politicians, and How to Grow Old, Ancient Wisdom for the Second Half of Life, and How to Run a Country, an Ancient Guide for Modern Readers, all of which are translated by Philip Freeman. There are different books in the series other than just the ones I've got here, but these are all translated from Latin and take advice from the works of Cicero, who was a Roman rhetorician. I think it's a really fun concept, and I think a fun way to introduce yourself to ancient texts and like learn a little bit about what some ancients believed. They all contain the Latin and the English translation, so if you are somebody that's interested in ancient languages as well, you'll get the Latin in here. But I just think these are gorgeous little books and such a fun concept. I think these are going to be great, and Cicero is somebody that I've not actually read that much by, so it'll be great for me to get more exposure to Cicero. Another book I was sent by the publisher is one I am so excited for. It's not out yet, but get it on your wish list, because that is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen R. Godsey. This is a non-fiction book of essays by the author on the topic of women's experiences of capitalism and how capitalism specifically affects the lives of women and sort of the ingrained sexism that is a part of capitalism, and looks at the alternative possibility of women's experiences under different systems. I think it just sounds fascinating. I mean, that is like a real seller of a title. It draws you in. It is obviously a bit clickbaity, but also not clickbaity, because it is one of the things it's going to argue for. So I think it's a lot of fun. I think it looks like it's going to be great. I'm a socialist, we all know this, so I just think I'm going to really enjoy this book, and I think it'll be interesting to read something specifically about women and sexism in this context, because it's not something I've read a dedicated book on, and obviously merges my two interests of kind of left-wing politics and feminism, so excited for this. I then have two books I actually just borrowed from my mum's house, which I thought I would show you since I have brought them down to London with me. The first one is another non-fiction book, and my mum lent me this one. It is The Enigma of Capital and the Crisis of Capitalism. We're on like a trend here right now, by David Harvey. David Harvey is an economist, and my mum really enjoyed this book. She read it when it came out in 2010, around the time of the massive sort of financial crash, and it discusses why capitalism is a system in which crashes are inevitable, and like to live in a capitalist society, this is bound to happen to the economy, and like it's going to crash again. So not really a cheerful book, but will be really, really interesting, and I keep saying I want to read more economics books, so I've heard amazing things about David Harvey, so I'm looking forward to trying this one. And I also have The Thebans by Liz Lochhead, which is a play by the Scottish playwright Liz Lochhead, an adapted version of ancient plays dealing with the story of Oedipus, Jocasta and Antigone. Obviously Liz Lochhead's own retelling of those stories. I recently read Liz Lochhead's Medea. I'd also taken that copy from my dad's bookshelves. This was my dad's as well, and really enjoyed it, and knew this was on his bookshelves, so decided to pick it up, and hopefully we'll be reading this soon as well. I did buy myself two other books. So the first one only cost me £3 from Fop, which is a record store in the UK I've mentioned before that sells a lot of cheap books, and this is the first 4 books in the Earthsea trilogy by Ursula K. Le Guin. I've mentioned before that I tried to read The Wizard of Earthsea. I actually got about halfway through it and put it down, but it's a book I've always wanted to try again, because I don't know if I just wasn't in the right mood for it, because objectively it seems like the kind of book I would love. And I really wanted to give it another shot, but didn't have my own copy, and when I saw the first 4 books in this gorgeous bind up for only £3 in Fop, it seemed like a sign, so I decided to pick it up. Hopefully I do end up enjoying the first one, because obviously I now have 4 of the books in one volume, but I do think that if I read it in the right frame of mind and at the right time, I am going to enjoy it. So yeah, it is a fantasy series about a young boy called Ged who has magical abilities and goes to study magic. At least that's kind of what was going on when I started the first book in the series, The Wizard of Earthsea, and I imagine lots more takes place after that. And the next book I actually picked up second hand online. It's The King's Peace by Jo Walton. So I didn't know this book existed until I was in Trans Real Books in Edinburgh, which is a science fiction and fantasy bookshop specifically that I love, and they had like the 3rd book in this series or something like that. It wasn't the first in the series, and I didn't actually know that Jo Walton had written a high fantasy series, So I knew that I had to seek out the first in that series and find out what it was about, because Jo Walton's Tooth and Claw is not only one of my favourite fantasy books of all time, it's one of my favourite books of all time. I think it's fantastic, and given how much I'm enjoying my epic fantasy at the moment and how much I've enjoyed Jo Walton in the past, I thought a combination of those two things would be right up my alley. Other than the fact that it's by Jo Walton, I don't know much about it. So the inside flap says, Cillian Acquain was 17 when the Jarnish raiders came. Had she been armed when they found her, she could have taken them all. As it was, it took 6 of them to subdue her. She will never forgive them. Thus begins her story, a story that takes her back to her family, with its ancient ties to the Vincan Empire that once ruled in Tir Tanagiri, and forward to Caer Tanaga, where the greatest man of his time, King Urdu, struggles to bind together the squabbling nobles and petty princes into a unified force that will drive out the barbarian invader and restore the king's peace. King Urdu will change Cillian's life. She will see him for what he is, the greatest hope the country has, and he will see her for what she is, the greatest warrior of her day. Together they will fight and suffer for an age of the world, for the things that the world always needs and which never last. Love a good high fantasy book, female central character and female warrior at that. Sounds wonderful. This is an ex-library copy, if you can tell by the kind of wrapper that's on it. But yeah, I was really pleased to find this quite cheap online. My next 2 books were also sent to me by publishers, and the next one is a non-fiction book that I am so excited about. It doesn't actually come out till the beginning of 2019, so I do apologise for getting you all excited about it beforehand, but I know a few of you are going to want to check it out, and that is Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age by Donna Zuckerberg. Nicely, it's not too chunky a non-fiction book. This is, as the subtitle suggests, it is the author looking at the way in which classics has been manipulated badly by modern day misogynists, how kind of certain like far right or alt-right, whatever you want to call them, groups use classics to excuse their beliefs. So for example, it says, she finds mixed in with weightlifting tips and misogynistic vitriol the words of the Stoics deployed to support an ideal version of masculine life. On other sites, pickup artists quote Ovid's Ars Amatoria to justify ignoring women's boundaries. By appropriating the classics, these men lend a veneer of intellectual authority and ancient wisdom to their project of patriarchal white supremacy. So she's examining this phenomenon online, and I imagine speaking out against it as a classicist, which is something I care very strongly for. And then we have What Would Boudica Do, which is a slightly more light-hearted non-fiction book by E. Foley and B. Coates. Everyday problems solved by history's most remarkable women. So this book isn't just about Boudica, it also includes women like Hypatia, Mary Wollstonecraft, Sappho, Frida Kahlo, a few ancient ones actually, Rosa Parks, Emily Dickinson, Cleopatra, Agatha Christie, lots of different women, and I kind of like the books that I showed you before. The point of this book is kind of taking historical women and looking at how they handle specific situations and applying them to our lives, to what would they do, so we can get advice. So things like Boudica and sticking up for yourself, Mary Wollstonecraft and calling herself a feminist, Mae West and being body positive, Rosa Parks and standing up to bullies, Hypatia and being a geek and proud, love that one. Yeah, it'll be interesting. Obviously books like this kind of simplify historical women and history, in my opinion, somewhat, but I also think that the concept of this is fun, and I like the idea, so I was willing to give it a shot. Plus that cover is gorgeous. But there are 2 more books I briefly want to mention, one of which I downloaded on Audiobook and the other of which I bought on my Kindle. So the audiobook I picked up is Tess of the Road by Rachel Hartman. So Rachel Hartman wrote the Seraphina duology, which I really enjoyed. These are dragon books set in a high fantasy world. I liked the first one, loved the sequel, so I'm really excited that she has a new book out, because I feel like she's somebody whose writing is just going to keep improving and introducing me to new exciting things in this world, because this book is set in the same world as the Seraphina duology, although it follows a different protagonist. So it follows one of Seraphina's half-siblings, and I read online that you can read Tess of the Road separately. You don't have to have read the Seraphina books to read this book if you really want to go into it, although I really enjoyed both the Seraphina books and I am glad that I've read them, so I would encourage you to try those. But this is following a kind of different story, just in the same world, which is a world in which dragons live in human form. So there are dragons in the world, but in order to live amongst humans, they take the form of humans, although people know that they are dragons because they have to wear, I think it was a bell, to sort of designate that they are actually dragons, and there's lots of court intrigue and fun fantasy stuff going on. And lastly, the Kindle book I picked up is Veins of Magic by Emma Hamm. This is the sequel to Heart of the Fae, which is an audiobook fantasy novel that I listened to last month and really enjoyed and wanted the sequel immediately because it leaves on a bit of a cliffhanger. However, the second one isn't out on audiobook, and I realised that the Kindle version was only a couple of pounds, so I decided to download it on there. This is a retelling of the Beauty and the Beast story, and I believe this kind of wraps up the story, this sequel. It's a kind of duology following the Beauty and the Beast retelling. And it follows Sorcha, who's a young woman who is a healer, and she wants to cure her father and her people of the blood beetle plague, so makes a deal with the fairies to find the cure, and is sent on a quest to this fairy isle to meet with this fairy Aemon, who is the sort of beast character, she's the beauty character, in order to save her people, and it's about what happens around that. It is a beautifully intricately woven world, though. It has the Beauty and the Beast base plot, but it's very much built up upon. The author's done a wonderful job of creating her own characters, her own world, and I just really got into this story. Although there was some like sort of romance fantasy cliches in there, I really didn't mind, and found the writing lovely and the world absorbing and the characters fun. So I'm really looking forward to finding out what happens next for Sorcha and Aemon in their story. Like I said, it kind of leaves on a cliffhanger at the end of the second one, so I'm going to be starting this one ASAP. But those are all the books that I have recently acquired. A nice variety of different things, I would say. Hopefully you found something that's piqued your interest. I would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on any of the books I've mentioned in this video. As always, I love chatting with you. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!